Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by American Jewish Committee. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Joining us today to examine the dangers of what he has called the growing normalization of anti-Semitism is AJC CEO David Harris. Described by the late Israeli President Shimon Peres as the foreign minister of the Jewish people, David Harris has led AJC since 1990. Moderating this conversation is AJC Chief Communications and Innovation Officer, Bel Etra Yoeli. After we hear from David and Bel, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Bel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Claire. And again, welcome to our global audience. David, as always, it's great to be with you. I know our audience is eager to hear from you on this very important subject, so let's jump right in. David, when we speak about or think about anti-Semitism and outrage, when it comes to you, I know three things. One is that this theme of outrage is not new for you. The second is that it's also very personal for you. And the third is that it was a motivating factor for your career choice. In fact, the personal very much became the professional. So why don't we begin there? Why is anti-Semitism so personal for you?
Thank you, Bel, and hello to our worldwide audience. It's very personal because as I began to grow up, I realized that I was in a very unusual home. It's not that my parents and other members of my extended family spoke so much about their past, but I kind of figured it out. I was curious, I got bits and pieces, and I began to connect the dots. And what I learned was that my parents, and of course as a child I looked up to, I venerated my parents, had been through hell time and again for the simple reason that they were Jews. My mother was born in the Soviet Union. By the age of 6, she and her family was able to leave because of anti-Semitism. They resettled in France, where they lived for 11 years until the Nazi occupation of France. And then again, as Jews, they did their best to flee the Nazi Germans, joined by the French Vichy collaborators. They were among the lucky ones. It's a whole long story. My father was born in Budapest. He was largely raised in Vienna. He was doing advanced scientific work on the synthesis of the heavy hydrogen atom by the age of 16 at the University of Vienna. And by 18, my father was on the sidewalks scrubbing the boots of Nazi officers until he was able to flee to France, and that unleashed a whole another chapter in his life. But the basic point, Bel, was here were my mother and father, who, for the very simple reason that they were Jews, had their lives uprooted time and again. And then to fast forward, in 1975, I went to Rome, where I ended up meeting my future wife, Giulietta. And here I encountered a whole other story about Jewish trauma. She and her 7 brothers and sisters and their families had been born and raised in Libya, North Africa, where their family had lived for centuries. By the time I met them, they had been refugees from Libya. Libya had not a single Jew left on its soil. At its peak, there were 40,000 Jews. Jews had lived on Libyan soil for over 2,000 years. And so I became the swivel-headed Jew by 1975 who said, what in the world is going on here? My wife and her family, wonderful people, living on Libyan soil for thousands of years, gone, and the country devoid of any Jews. My mother and father the same, every other member of my extended family the same. And this was not something I could sort of passively accept or simply park somewhere, Bell. It became a defining feature of my life.
That makes a lot of sense, David. And I know, in addition to your experience with your parents and your wife and learning about those experiences, you also early in your career were working with specific cohorts of the Jewish community, in particular Soviet Jewry. And I also know you were involved with the rescue of Ethiopian Jews. You got to see through these experiences and others anti-Semitism up close. And what was that like, and how did that inform kind of your thinking on the subject?
So if the first part, my immediate family, kind of shaped my outlook on life, it was the second part that you're now mentioning that in a way shaped my professional direction. Because I went to the Soviet Union in 1974, very unusually, not as a tourist, as one of 6 Americans selected to go and actually teach in the Soviet Union while 6 Soviets came to teach in the United States. It was one of the early fruits of what was called détente, a kind of quieting of relations between Moscow and Washington. So whatever I knew about my family was in the past. But now I morphed into the present. And during those months I was in the Soviet Union, I was there as a teacher, but I eventually ended up with a second life as a Jew, as a Jewish activist who spent all my free time either at the synagogue, the one synagogue in Moscow, or in the homes of refuseniks. And there were many that I met. And then in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, the same story, until eventually in December of 1974, I was detained by Soviet authorities, put under hotel house arrest for 3 days, and then expelled. But I had seen many Jews, Bell, with my own eyes, I heard with my own ears, anti-Semitism was alive and well. And the aim of the Soviet policy may not have been the same as the Nazi policy of establishing death camps, but it was a process of cultural genocide, which was meant to extinguish any last vestige of Jewish pride, knowledge, identity among millions of Soviet Jews. And having now witnessed this with my own eyes, I realized the story was not just in the past. It was not just about honoring memory. It was about responding to the present. And after that Soviet experience, I became involved, as you said, with the Ethiopian Jewry story, which itself is another absolutely remarkable and little known story of Jewish survival and pride in Ethiopia and Israeli courage and ingenuity in the rescue. But I also traveled to Ethiopia. And again, I saw with my own eyes Jews in Ethiopia who wanted nothing more than to be Jews and to preserve this identity that some say dates back to the time of Solomon and Sheba. And for that simple act of wanting to be Jews, the Mengistu communist regime in Ethiopia at the time was doing everything possible to suppress them, not to mention the bigotry they experienced from some of their Muslim and Christian neighbors. So once again, I saw Jews trying to leave, trying to escape, trying to start a new life. And professionally, I realized, again, this is the calling. I know it sounds a bit corny, but the first act was I have an obligation to protect the memory of what happened to my family. But in Act 2, I realized, no, that's not nearly enough. What needs to happen is a response to anti-Semitism today, which is in a way a kind of culturally genocidal anti-Semitism. And I couldn't sit on the sidelines.
And I know, David, those were some of the first of many experiences that you would have where you would see anti-Semitism close up and experience this kind of question about where is the outrage, where is the reaction to this persecution or suppression of Jewish culture and identity. And I want to ask you about another specific experience. I've heard you speak before about a very consequential year in your life, fast forwarding to 2000, 2001, when you and your family moved to Switzerland. And for several reasons, whatever you had seen and you were feeling before became even stronger and more focused. Like you said, not just on the past and what you had experienced, but how things were changing in the present during that time. Can you tell us about that year and the different pieces that you saw?
Sure. So just to bridge this space from where we were a moment ago to Switzerland, I ended up, to my own surprise, becoming a lifer in the Jewish community. And that was not my original career intention. People sometimes think that, those of us who work in the Jewish community are perhaps a breed apart, who went to Jewish day school, who went to Jewish summer camp, who come from observant homes, who were frequent synagogue goers. I didn't score high on any of those criteria, but in that Soviet experience, especially because I was intimately involved straight through then from 1974 all the way until the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, and through the Ethiopian Jewry experience, I realized that I need to do this professionally. And I joined AJC in 1979 after a few years in Rome and Vienna working with Soviet Jewish emigration. And as you suggest, Bell, from that point forward, it became part of my work. And of course, one of the things I kept hearing prior to Geneva was this mantra of never again, never again. Now, I say mantra, obviously it's critically important to say never again. Or for those in Hebrew who say lo tishkach, do not forget, zachor, remember. And I heard European leaders and others on certain commemorative days doing exactly that. But then I moved to Geneva with my family for a year. I took on the chairmanship of an AJC affiliate at the time, United Nations Watch. I became a visiting a professor at Johns Hopkins University's graduate campus in Bologna, Italy. And there I was on European soil. And there I saw in that year, Bell, the rebirth of anti-Semitism in Europe. We're not talking now about the Soviet Union or Ethiopia. We're talking about Europe, beginning in neighboring France. And I tried to connect the rebirth with the never again notion. And it was missing. It was completely missing. There was a disconnection. And that was infuriating, to say the least. So what happened in that year? Well, several things happened, the first of which was 2 of our children went to school in Geneva. They went to a school called Collège de Léman. It's a private international school. And during the course of that year, they themselves either experienced or witnessed acts of anti-Semitism on the campus. I won't take the time to describe them here, but what was most outrageous was the response, or I should say, lack of response of the school. We raised the issues as a family. The school's essential response was, leave us alone. Or as 2 of the teachers said to one of the children at the time, this is not the business of the school. So anti-Semitism on campus is not the business of the school. I ended up writing an op-ed in the International New York Times. It was then called the International Herald Tribune, the same thing, in which I expressed my outrage, not just at the incidents, bad though they were, but even more at the officials responsible for the school, for the creating of the climate, which should have been of mutual respect. After all, Geneva especially, an international city, a multicultural city, and they were unwilling to grapple with specific issues of anti-Semitism, and it was outrageous. So on the personal level, it touched us. I'll go further. Later in the year, as a family, we went for a couple of days to London. And in London, we were walking around, sightseeing, touring, and we stumbled upon a rally. We stayed at the edge, and it turned out to be a rally against Israel. Now, remember, 2000, 2001 was really important because it was when Bill Clinton, in his last months as president, tried to achieve a historic peace deal with Israel and the Palestinians. And Ehud Barak, Israel's prime minister, was President Clinton's partner. And not only did the Palestinians reject the two-state offer made by Barak and Clinton, but Arafat, the head of the PLO at the time, triggered what became known as the Second Intifada. And by the way, for those who may think that this is simply my interpretation of history, I urge you to read Bill Clinton's autobiography, My Life, which has a section on the collapse of the talks and his, not mine, his pointing the finger at Arafat for the failure of the talks. So in that climate where Israel had offered a two-state deal, had been rejected, Arafat triggered the Second Intifada. And those of you who were old enough at the time will remember it was a very bloody intifada in which buses, cafes, pizzerias, Passover seders were among the targets of Palestinian terrorists. And Israel had no choice but to respond. So I watched all this, and that rally in London was connected to it. But they drew different conclusions. And when we arrived, the person with the microphone speaking in front of a few hundred people was just about to tell the audience a joke. And the joke was as follows. What's the difference between a pizza and a Jew? And he paused for effect, and then he responded. They both go into the oven, but at least the pizza doesn't scream. The audience reacted with laughter. It was stunning in the middle of London. To my pride and dismay, the next thing I knew, I saw my wife on the stage, right in the face of that joke teller. I was with the children, and she was up there, and she was confronting him. She was speaking to him in Arabic, in a way I don't think he'd ever been spoken to before, much less by a woman. And I had total awe that my wife, alone, on her own, confronted that anti-Semite when hundreds of people were there laughing and supporting him. I think back to Menachem Begin, who came up with a notion which he called JWTK, Jews with trembling knees, which was the way he often described Jews in their diaspora history, as his way of saying, in Israel, we are creating a new Jew, an unafraid Jew, a Jew without trembling knees. And I saw in my wife, proud Jew, proud Zionist, the courage to confront. I also saw other things in that year, Bell. Because we were in Geneva and because I was chairing the UN Watch, I saw the UN in Geneva up close, and especially what was then called the Human Rights Commission, now the Human Rights Council. I cannot begin to tell you the travesty that we witnessed in that body when it came to Israel. And again, triggering the outrage. How could a body with a UN imprimatur that also included good countries, decent countries, democratic countries, allow the numerical majority to take over and to turn that body into a precision-guided missile against the state of Israel? To give you a sense, 2 years after we left, Libya, the Libya of Gaddafi, became the chair of the UN Human Rights Council. elected by the members, voted on by the members. Or the fact that in that then commission, now council, still true, only one country on the planet, one country, you can guess which one that is, has a separate agenda item, a standing agenda item, is reviewed separately from every other nation on earth, Bell. And when I say every other nation, consider North Korea, Iran, Syria, Belarus, Venezuela, Cuba, I can keep going. None of those nations are deemed to have a separate agenda item, neither then when we were there, nor now. So when it comes to outrage, I could barely contain the anger. And the other piece while we were in Geneva was, for better or for worse, I'm quite fluent in several languages. So I wanted, while I was in Geneva, to spend time practicing those languages, reading newspapers, which I've always enjoyed doing. So I would daily buy Italian newspapers, French newspapers, Spanish newspapers, in addition to English language. And again, with that second intifada as backdrop, I was shocked at what I saw. I was stunned at what I saw, at how European media outlets, mainstream, well-known in so many cases, turned the second intifada into a media hate fest against Israel, turned the Holocaust on its head and used it as a cudgel against Israel, restored the deicide charge by creating the Palestinian child as a child on the cross. The new Christ child murdered by the Jews. And in fact, created a booklet. It's hard to see on the screen afterwards, because I began to collect these cartoons and these headlines and these photographs that were being used. And I called it Israel in the European media. And it's just a sampling. And once again, I want to be clear. This is not about whether someone liked the Israeli prime minister at the time or didn't, or liked one political party in Israel or another. This is not about that, Bell. This was about an attempt to demonize, stigmatize, isolate, and pummel one nation on earth, which happened to be the only Jewish majority nation on earth. And as with the school story, too many otherwise good, decent, caring individuals, institutions, and countries turned a blind eye. It was too inconvenient for them. It was too costly politically or diplomatically for them. It was too costly perhaps domestically or electorally for them. It was too costly with possible donors or supporters. So they looked the other way. So I asked myself, 55 years after the Holocaust, which took place on European soil against the backdrop of centuries and centuries of anti-Semitism in Europe, what did the words "never again" actually mean? And sadly, I concluded, not a whole lot.
It's hard to listen to you speak about those experiences, David, because I know also in a way it only got worse from there. Before following up on the European context in particular, I wanted to also ask you about two other events that happened during that time. One was the Durban Conference, and of course 9/11, and how those two events contributed, or what we saw in terms of anti-Semitism that touched on some of the themes you just mentioned.
Yeah, I know this is not a very happy, uplifting conversation for our viewers, and I apologize, and I wish I could say, with a nod to Hollywood, that there's some happy ending here, but maybe outrage loves company, and that's why it's so important for me to share at least my journey, and hopefully what I'm saying touches some chords in those of you who are watching, who may also have your own experiences to add to the story. But why for me, the theme of where's the outrage becomes so pressing. So Durban, the infamous Durban Conference, held in Durban, South Africa in 2001, under the auspices of the United Nations. And aimed allegedly at combating racism. The whole notion of Durban, if you go back and look at the title and the description, is about combating racism. Durban became the symbol, if you will, of racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, Holocaust denial and trivialization. Durban, in a word, became a hate fest. And just as Munich in 1938 became associated for many with the word appeasement, so for many in 2001, Durban, an otherwise lovely city, became associated with the notion of anti-Semitism on steroids. AJC and our affiliate UN Watch sponsored a delegation that went to Durban. And I was supposed to go with them. But I was invited by the Bush administration to become an official member of the US delegation and to accompany then Secretary of State Colin Powell. Now, let me be clear, the invitation came before the hate fest erupted, when people still thought this was going to be a normal conference. But when it turned out to be a very abnormal conference, the US, to its credit, withdrew. And so I did not go, but in the meantime, we sent our representatives there who gave firsthand accounts, some of which were written and indeed published by AJC, and they're chilling. So here again, Bell, it's the same theme. The UN is seen by many as a legitimate, even venerable institution. The hate fest took place under the auspices of a UN event designed to combat racism that had both a governmental side and a non-governmental side, and AJC was part of the non-governmental side. But in the end, it was turned on its head to attack Israel, to attack Zionism, and by the way, to threaten and intimidate and bully Jews on the ground there who came to represent their own institutions and to genuinely participate in the fight against racism. By the way, fast forward, this year, again, to show you the normalization of these kinds of things, is the 20th anniversary. So what's the UN doing? It's not planning a denunciation, it's planning a commemoration of the original conference, just as it did 10 years ago. Now, 10 years ago, AJC was among those who strenuously urged countries to avoid participating and lending more legitimacy 10 years later to that hate fest. 14 countries boycotted. And it's, one of those things, Bell, where, again, time permitting, I could recite for you the 14 countries because I remember them with enormous gratitude and appreciation. But now it's the 20th anniversary, and the UN is again planning to meet. To its credit, the US has just announced it will not participate. The second country to do so is Australia. Bless them both, the US and Australia. We're counting on other countries, including those that boycotted in 2011, to do so, and perhaps be joined by still other countries. But that, too, was part of the normalization under the UN imprimatur, if you will. And then you mentioned 9/11. And just one memory, because I know we don't have all day. Here we were in New York. I mean, our building is roughly 3 miles from the World Trade Center. Within a day of the attack, we received what was then called a fax. For those of you who remember a fax, it's not quite a telegram, which was even older, and it's not quite an email or text message, somewhere in between. and it came from a European Jewish community, partners of ours. It was marked urgent. Dear AJC friends, the press in our country are reporting on the front page that the attack was done by the Mossad, that the 4,000 Jews who allegedly worked in the World Trade Center had been notified in advance and stayed home. That, they told us, is on the front page of the newspapers or among the leading stories in the radio and television reports. Please, please, please tell us that it's not true. And if possible, give us the names of some Jews that died at the World Trade Center to factually disprove what's being reported. Now, pause for a moment. Pause for a moment. That there might be a lunatic out there who wants to associate the Jews and Mossad in Israel with the World Trade Center. Awful, but okay. But when it becomes normalized by the leading media in at least one country, if not more, to the point where the Jewish community there feels endangered because they somehow willy-nilly become connected. After all, if the Jews were responsible for World Trade Center, then how can you trust the Jews in this country or that country? And we actually had to begin to provide names. It so happened that we knew names because there were people we knew, including the husband of a former colleague here at AJC who was killed. But we actually went through the exercise of saying, well, here are some names. So for me, to the theme of this session, Bell, if my family experiences shaped my outlook from the very beginning, and if my early years dealing with the Soviet Union and Ethiopia and the Jewish communities there pointed me in a professional direction, then the years 2000 and 2001 made absolutely clear that we had immense challenges in front of us. And those immense challenges were not just the resurgence of anti-Semitism, which was real, but also how to galvanize the proper response, which means not indifference, not apathy, not dismissal, not denial, not trivialization, nor even rationalization, which we also heard, but rather the right response. And the right response, we believed then, but it took years to convince, was, for goodness sakes, anti-Semitism is real, it's lethal, left unchecked, it will metastasize, and it will, like a cancer, destroy societies. Jews are only the start of the story. For heaven's sakes, have you learned nothing from your own history in Europe especially? And don't think that fighting anti-Semitism should be left to local Jewish communities and to the American Jewish Committee. Fighting anti-Semitism is your challenge, not just ours. You need to mobilize all the resources and strengths of your governments, police, intelligence, education, justice, go down the list. You need to mobilize it. You need to see it not as a Jewish problem, but a French problem, a Belgian problem, a Dutch problem, a European problem, in other words. And that bell took years and years, and that's a whole other story.
David, I want to soon fast forward us to today, but before leaving Europe, and just to quickly touch on what you mentioned, you kind of described for us some of the responses you were getting. But when you, after Geneva, when you first started, with AJC traveling to countries, beginning with France, as you mentioned, to sound the alarm about anti-Semitism, what was happening? What was the missing piece? Were governments not acknowledging it, not getting it? Because that must have created its own sense of outrage. And I know that we're still at a point today where things have improved, but we're still struggling there in some context. So can you set the stage for us and what was happening in those conversations?
Yes. I can still hear, for example, Bell, because France was the epicenter in 2000, 2001, 2002, for a whole host of reasons. And we, because we've had good relations with France for many years. We were fortunate to have access to President Jacques Chirac himself, including some very small, even intimate meetings with President Chirac. On the one hand, President Chirac had done a very important thing. He was the first French leader to publicly and formally acknowledge that Vichy during the war was France. Vichy was not some disembodied, non-French force. Vichy was France at the time. And for my parents who were in France, that was an extremely important statement that he made. But I hear it ringing in my ears still, that meeting, the first meeting with Jacques Chirac, where we presented this to him, Bell, as friends of France, not with an accusing finger, but seeking to inform the president and to enlist his help and the help of the state. And I can still hear his voice. I mean, I would repeat in French, but it would take time to then translate to English. But in English, it was, my friends, I know France better than you do. There is no anti-Semitism in France today. That was the basic response. And by the way, in someone's living room, it's easy to talk back to the president of a country. This is what I would say to the president of a country. In real life, it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to construct it in a way that gets the message across without burning bridges and shutting down the possibility of future meetings. Because at the end of the day, we weren't just trying to score a point and write a press release about, here's what we told President Chirac. We were seriously, sincerely trying to enlist the French state to fight a cancer which began with Jews, but which we knew, as I said, would spread. It took years. And that was repeated when we went to Brussels and spoke with European Union officials and elsewhere. And of course, because this is all about politics, even when you make progress, Bell, you have leaders who lose elections, you have leaders who retire, you have leaders who are replaced. So for AJC, this has been an ongoing effort for the last 20 years. Fortunately, there is some good news. The European Union in 2015 appointed a senior coordinator to deal with anti-Semitism. We work with her very closely. She's extremely committed. Fortunately, in France, in Germany, in the UK, in Bulgaria, in a number of other countries, there is now a senior official inside the government responsible for monitoring and combating anti-Semitism and for promoting Jewish life. Fortunately, there's now a standardized working definition of anti-Semitism so that people have a common understanding. In the early days, we realized people didn't necessarily have the common understanding of anti-Semitism that we assumed they did. It's an ongoing issue, but over 30 countries, including most of Europe and the US State Department and the Biden administration now, through the statement of Secretary of State Tony Blinken, have all embraced what we call the working definition of anti-Semitism, in which AJC played a part. So that's been standardized. So I think we've made progress, but we still have a long way to go, and it's an uphill battle.
David, before moving to the United States, because of course anti-Semitism has crossed the United States, I can't leave Europe and Europe today without asking you about, where things are. And in particular, I'm thinking about the Sarah Hallemi case in France. And of course, a horrible victim of a horrific crime, an anti-Semitic crime. But she was only one of the most recent examples in a slew of examples that have happened. And the perpetrators often have not been fully brought to justice. And I'd like you to comment on this so our viewers can understand, what is the disconnect between clearly anti-Semitic horrific crimes and in Europe, in some places, still these crimes not being acknowledged fully as anti-Semitism?
I wish there were a simple answer, Bell, but nonetheless, I'll try to summarize our perspective. And I'll put it very bluntly. When an act of anti-Semitism, and by the way, I think this applies to the US as well in a number of cases as we transition in the last segment of this session. When it comes from the far right, when it comes from neo-Nazis, when it comes with someone with a swastika tattoo on their arm, when it comes from someone who openly identifies with the far right, white supremacy, neo-Nazi nostalgia, in Europe, the judgment is pretty quick in most cases. And the attack is most often seen through the lens of ideology. When it comes from other sources, far left, minority, immigrant communities, we've seen a tendency to be much more cautious in labeling something ideological. In other words, if a Jew is killed from one of those communities, there's often a legal and judicial kind of acrobatics to try and point to mental illness, impairment of judgment through drugs, other circumstances to avoid what often, not always, Bell, but often is an unavoidably stark conclusion. There was anti-Semitism as a motivation. How do we know? Because, for example, when someone shouts Allahu Akbar before throwing the body of Sarah Hallemi from her third floor balcony, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that there was anti-Semitism. Or even a few minutes earlier, in her apartment, when he saw her menorah on a shelf and realized, if he didn't already know, that she was Jewish, he himself said that something set him off when he saw the menorah. Now, this perpetrator, and no one questions that he was the perpetrator 4 years ago in murdering 65-year-old Sarah Hallemi, Orthodox Jew, mother and physician, but he will never stand trial for the crime of murder. Instead, he was deemed by the highest judicial authorities to have suffered from a delirious episode, quote unquote, based on his use of drugs. And the French Jewish community is beyond outraged. And Bell, it's not the first such time. Dial back to 2003. Dial back to a man whose name may not be well known today, Sebastian Selam, a French Jew, a disc jockey, who was murdered. And look at how the legal proceedings went forward. Look at how they tried desperately to avoid the words anti-Semitism or Jew hatred. And it's to the credit of President Macron, in both cases, 18 years ago and 4 years ago, that now he has publicly identified the office of the President of France with the characterization of both as anti-Semitic crimes. And of course, in between, there were others. I recently wrote an article, Bell, citing this example, an example in Germany, attack on a synagogue, an example in a cafe in Belgium, which had a sign that publicly said, we serve dogs, we do not serve Jews. And an example in Norway, where a government-sponsored public event included a rapper who used the opportunity to go after the Jews, including the effing Jews. In all 4 cases, as I cited, the obvious conclusion that anti-Semitism was central to the story was completely missing from the legal, judicial, governmental conclusions. So the theme, where's the outrage? I ask again, where's the outrage? Where's the outrage? This is not about, and as we transition, Bill, this is not about whether someone is a Reform Jew, a conservative Jew, a Reconstructionist Jew, an Orthodox Jew, a Haredi Jew, a secular Jew. This is not about whether a Jew is center, left, or right on the political spectrum. This is about something way bigger. And this is why I keep asking, where is the outrage? These acts, what we've been talking about, should unite not only every Jew, but every person of goodwill who understands we're all in the same boat. And if the boat springs a leak because of an anti-Semite, don't think that we're not all going to sink together, just as if the boat sprung a leak because of a racist attacking African Americans or Africans, or if the boat sprung a leak because someone is attacking Asians. We're all in this boat together. So I keep asking, where is the outrage? Because I think we're at a point where we all need to be not just angry, but angry and mobilized. The anger or the outrage left to its own on the couch or in bed just ain't enough. Where is the mobilization, the movement that says no more, no more, no more Sarah Hallemis being thrown out of third floor windows for the simple act of being a Jew or having a menorah? I can keep going. I hope I've made the point.
David, I want to ask you about 30 questions in 14 minutes. So I'm gonna try to combine here. Moving to the United States, you commented on anti-Semitism and other types of hate crimes are addressed differently depending on the source. So I'd like you to comment on that in the United States and what that looks like. And also following up on that, you've mentioned in the United States, we're now seeing the normalization of anti-Semitism. And I think our viewers would like to know what is concerning you and what that actually looks like to you when we talk about the normalization of anti-Semitism here.
In less than 14 minutes. So I think I can illustrate it for starters in this way, Bell. Here we've seen a resurgence of anti-Semitism. Even when AJC saw it in Europe in 2000, 2001, we were the first ones to blow the whistle. We were the first ones to identify the multiple sources. We were the first ones to call on governments to do what they're supposed to be doing. To be honest, we didn't anticipate the speed and intensity with which it would cross the ocean here to the United States. Having said that, when it came to Charlottesville, people remember Pittsburgh and the 11 Jewish worshipers who were murdered, to Paulway and the Chabad synagogue, to January the 6th and Camp Auschwitz T-shirts, including the word staff on the back, or 6 million, weren't enough. The outrage is pretty clear. In fact, when AJC launched our Show Up for Shabbat campaign after Pittsburgh, which was a hashtag that we promoted aggressively, energetically through social media, it was said that it generated the single greatest act of solidarity with American Jews in American history. Some 250 million people, I gather, engaged with the hashtag. So many showed up at local synagogues. The synagogue that I went to in New York included diplomats, a big congregation of Catholics from a church a block or two away. Very powerful, very moving. Extraordinary, sets an example. But then we get to the politicization of the subject, because in that era as well, there were 2 Jews, for example, who were murdered in Jersey City as Jews. We had a congresswoman from Michigan who very quickly tweeted after hearing that news story, and who said, "White supremacy kills." It turned out that the people arrested for the murder were not white. They were African American. They claimed to belong to some cult named Black Hebrews, and which alleged that they were the authentic and original Jews, and the rest of us were imposters, for which 2 people paid with their lives. So what did this congresswoman do? She very quickly deleted her tweet, but not before a number of people, including us, had screenshot it. And she lost interest. This is my point, Bill. She lost interest in who the perpetrators were. It didn't fit the narrative. Our point to this Congresswoman or others, if you're serious about anti-Semitism and you're not trying to use it as a weapon to advance your political cause, your political party, or your own sort of political ambitions, you need to be swivel-headed. And if you're not willing to call out anti-Semitism, whatever its source, wherever it comes from, please get out of the way and don't try and use us to advance your own goals, because your goals are not our goals. We're not here to advance her particular narrative any more than we are to advance the narrative of anyone else who's using this issue. We're here as the American Jewish Committee to do everything we possibly can, as smartly, as determinedly as we possibly can, to help ensure the safety and security of Jews wherever they live, however they choose to live, however they manifest their Jewish identity or pride or faith, and to mobilize governments and civil society to join with us as a common effort, So the weaponization of anti-Semitism has continued right here in the United States, as we've seen.
David, I'm going to try again to combine a couple of questions we're getting. I asked you about kind of the normalization of anti-Semitism and whether during the pandemic or even before that in the past couple of years, it feels like in the United States context, we're seeing just anti-Semitism being more prevalent, and not just in terms of attacks. During the pandemic, we saw utilization of Holocaust imagery. And, you mentioned members of Congress. We've seen, although very, still few compared to all of Congress, we have seen members of Congress use, on both sides of the aisle, either identify with anti-Semitic movements or use tropes. And on college campuses today in particular, we're seeing constant examples of demonization of Jewish students because of their pro-Israel identity, demonization of Israel. But when we see this picture, how can we not be deeply concerned about the United States and the place of anti-Semitism in our country right now? What should we be thinking about? What should be the main takeaways in terms of people who are concerned about this issue?
Well, exactly, Bill. I think you've said it exactly right. And my fear is that as these incidents and these moments accumulate, while some people are waking up and standing up and speaking out and joining with others, whether here at AJC or through other institutions, others are asleep or hiding under the blankets or living in denial in the belief that it doesn't really touch them. The attacks in Brooklyn or here in Lower Manhattan were against other Jews because they were identifiable Jews and we're not. So it'll pass us by. Or it was about students on campus or others who publicly identify with Israel and call themselves Zionists proudly. But we're not, we're different. We're low key. We don't talk about those things. We're the good Jews. Let me dial back to my own family for a moment. My one and only and favorite uncle, my mother's brother, who arrived in France with my mother on the eve of the war, apparently had a girlfriend, a French Jew named Natasha. Obviously, I never met her. My mother described her as very beautiful. When the Nazis arrived in France, my uncle begged Natasha to join him and her family to travel south to try and escape the Nazis and find a safe haven. And their response to my uncle was, you need to flee because you're foreign-born Jews. You were born in the Soviet Union in this case, but we Jews born in France are different. We will be safe. You go, we will stay. The end of the story, I'm told, is that Natasha and her family were arrested, deported. Natasha was put into a brothel in one of the Nazi concentration camps until the point where she was of no more use to the Nazis and she was murdered. My point, and I don't mean to put such a dramatic touch on it in 2021, Bill, but just to make the underlying point, we're all in this together. We're all in this together as far as anti-Semites are concerned. So we have in the US Congress today at least one Democrat and at least one Republican who have publicly associated themselves with clearly anti-Semitic expressions. The Republican who loves conspiracy theories, including against Jews, was elected with nearly 75% of the vote in that congressional district, Bill. So for those voters, it obviously did not matter to them, or at least it did not matter in a negative way, to elect a member of Congress to go and represent them in Washington while embracing all of these theories, including Jews and space lasers and God knows what else. That was not an impediment. We have a Democrat who expressed anti-Semitic views on social media, which got wide distribution, who was reelected in November with the endorsement of the Democratic Party establishment. And those views that she expressed were not seen as an impediment either to her representation of her district and indeed her party. So this is what's happening today. What's happening today is that families, in many cases, are having to be careful about choosing high schools for their children, not to mention universities for their children, where those children will feel safe and protected and secure as Jews, or if they wish to engage in pro-Israel activity. We now have to pick our media outlets more carefully based on what we may or may not hear. We saw the most influential newspaper in the United States not long ago publish a blatantly anti-Semitic cartoon, which made it through layers of editing and review. We saw a popular satirical television show not long ago allow a blatantly anti-Semitic statement to be made in one of the monologues. And even after the protest, at least in the case of the New York Times, there was some after the fact regret, change of policy. In the case of Saturday Night Live, and we spoke with them for 45 minutes, but no regret, no apology. And if there's a change of policy, we don't know it. So what I'm saying is, Bell, when we have to start worrying about our colleges, our universities, our high schools, our media outlets, our Congress, the pandemic, the use and abuse and misuse of Holocaust images, that now everyone who's an anti-vaxxer has the right in their own minds to put on a yellow star as if they have been targeted by a nation or by a Gestapo or by a governor of a state, in this case, Illinois, who's identified with words like Arbeit macht frei from Auschwitz. What I fear is that as the Holocaust recedes in memory, as the survivors, the eyewitnesses, the storytellers vanish, on the one hand. On the second hand, as social media reaches billions of people in an instant without as many filters as one might wish, when liberal democracy itself is under assault, when the center of society, including here in the United States, is under siege from the radical right and the totalitarian left, all of these things are seeping back in, Bell, and the response is insufficient, which is why I'm calling it the normalization of anti-Semitism. Too many people are getting used to it. They're losing their sense of outrage, their sense of shock about what it means, both now and in the past. And what I'm saying instead is, it's time for all of us Jews and non-Jews alike, who have a stake in democracy, a stake in pluralism, a stake in mutual respect, a stake in combating all forms of hatred, including anti-Semitism as well as racism and xenophobia. It's time for all of us to stand up, to link arms, and to say, no, not on our watch.
Thank you so much, David. I know we probably need a part 2 to talk about why there isn't enough outrage when it comes to this subject and to dissect that even further, but unfortunately we are out of time. I apologize that we didn't get to more questions, but I know that we will continue to be addressing this important subject of anti-Semitism further on Advocacy Anywhere. So thank you again, David, for your insights. And Claire, I'm going to turn it back to you to close us out.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Belle. I would also like to thank our audience for joining us. If you enjoyed today's program, please be sure to tune in to AJC Virtual Global Forum, the premier global Jewish advocacy event of the year, taking place online June 6th through 9th. To learn more about Global Forum, please visit ajc.org/globalforum. Thank you and have a wonderful day.